You were never supposed to hear this. Even now, as my voice reaches you, there are men behind locked doors who would rather you turn this off, look away, forget. Because what happened on a humid January night in 1960 was not just another battle of the Vietnam War. It was the opening of a door into psychological warfare so profound, so dangerous, that to name it is to risk becoming part of it. I'm not telling you a story tonight. I'm pulling you into a truth hidden in classified files, a truth that has warped the minds of soldiers, commanders, and intelligence analysts for more than 60 years. This is not about ghosts, though it will feel like it. This is not about demons, though you may taste their breath. This is about a woman who understood fear at a level the modern world still cannot process. Her name, whispered in Pentagon corridors like a curse, was Nguyen Thi Dinh. To American intelligence, she was the most dangerous woman in Southeast Asia. To her people, she was a savior. To her enemies, she was something else entirely, a force that dismantled their minds from the inside out. She didn't just fight soldiers. She made them question reality. She made them run from shadows. She made them turn on themselves. Tonight, you will hear about the operation that governments still keep sealed under classified stamps. You'll hear about the night when 5,000 unarmed women shattered the world's most advanced military training without firing a single bullet. You'll hear about Operation Mind Spider, a campaign so carefully engineered, so saturated with psychological triggers, that men who lived through it woke up decades later screaming at the sound of a child's laughter. As you listen, I want you to understand something. You're not just learning history. You're stepping into a labyrinth of hidden systems. How fear is manufactured, how minds are broken, how ends. The first key to understanding Nguyen Thi Dinh is not her tactics, not her armies, but her childhood. You cannot understand the monster a system creates without seeing the cage it built around her. She was born in 1920 in a village suffocated under French colonial rule, a system that didn't just control land and labor, but thoughts, memories, and identity itself. Public executions were staged like theater. Villages vanished overnight for harboring sympathies. The air itself was weaponized, thick with rumors, humiliation, and staged spectacles of pain. This was not law and order. This was programming. Dinh learned early how fear moves through a crowd. At 7 years old, she was forced to watch a suspected revolutionary slowly torn apart before his family. But what scarred her was not the blood. It was the precision. She saw the French officer timing each cut, not for maximum pain, but for maximum psychological damage to the witnesses. She noticed the way his eyes weren't on the victim, but on the villagers, who flinched, who vomited, who stared blankly. Even as a child, she recognized the pattern. Pain inflicted on one, fear imprinted on all. This was her first lesson in mass control. Most children would be broken by this. Dinh absorbed it, not with joy, not with ideology, with the cold detachment of a scientist. She began to understand that trauma spread like a virus, predictable and contagious. Certain sounds triggered certain reflexes. Certain images bypassed thought entirely and went straight into the nervous system. She saw the hidden language of terror, the code the colonizers spoke without words. By 16, she was already fluent in it. By 20, she had suffered losses most people never recover from. Her husband beaten to death in a colonial prison, her child torn from her arms, her own body broken by imprisonment. Each event that should have shattered Haitian. What happened to Nguyen Thi Dinh inside the colonial prison system would destroy most human beings. For her, it became a laboratory. She entered Bahra prison in 1940 with an 8-month-old son torn from her arms. A wound she said she never stopped hearing. Guards chose their moments with surgical cruelty. They didn't just arrest her. They waited until she was breastfeeding. They understood that pain can be amplified by timing. They thought this would break her. Instead, it gave her a blueprint. Bahra was more than cells and bars. It was a living experiment in psychological collapse. Sensory deprivation cells so tight you couldn't stand up. Weeks of silence broken only by screams. food mixed with sand to grind down your teeth, salt water to drink until thirst rewrote your sanity. Prisoners became hollow, their eyes glassy, their minds slipping into unreachable places. Dinh did not look away. She watched how different people fractured under different pressures. She memorized the stages of breakdown. She saw how isolation made strong men doubt their own memories, how a child's cry could shatter the will of the most hardened fighters. She began to catalog human vulnerabilities the way a doctor charts symptoms. Some could take beatings but went mad under silence. Some endured hunger but lost their grip when mocked with sounds of their children. Others were immune to pain but crumbled under humiliation. Dinh's mind was storing every reaction, every trigger. She wasn't just surviving. She was studying. And she began to notice something else. The guards. They believed they were in control, but their fear leaked through. Glances over their shoulders, whispered superstitions, talismans hidden under their uniforms. Dinh realized fear was a weapon that worked both ways. Properly cultivated, it could be turned back on its wielder. This became her core doctrine. That terror could be engineered, redirected, magnified until it infected an entire force without a single bullet fired. When she walked out of Bahra in 1943, starved, sick, labeled hysterical by French doctors, she was not hysterical. She was a student who had completed her education. And what she carried in her mind was more dangerous than any rifle. In 1946, when Nguyen Thi Dinh stood before Ho Chi Minh in the northern stronghold, she did not bow like others did. She looked at him the way a scholar looks at another mind capable of understanding. The old revolutionary had seen war in every form: attrition, ambush, propaganda. But what stood before him that day was something else. A woman who spoke of war as if it were a disease of perception. She told him that fear could be engineered like a contagion, that once released, it could spread without soldiers, without weapons, without oversight. Ho Chi Minh listened in silence. When she finished, he said only one thing: "You understand what others do not. That in the modern world, the battlefield is inside the mind." Then he gave her something no one else received: permission to build her own program, beyond the oversight of the military command. It was not a gift. It was a dangerous trust. A covenant. Ninh took it literally. For over a decade she disappeared into the shadows of the Mekong Delta, studying, experimenting, building what she called Operation Mind Spider. The name was chosen with precision. Spiders do not chase. They weave. They sense vibration. They manipulate perception through tension. And when the prey believes it is safe, that is when it is already caught. Her network grew in silence. Farmers, street vendors, prostitutes, children. They became her eyes, her instruments. Each learned fragments of psychological manipulation: how to seed a rumor that grows like mold in a man's brain, how to mimic the voice of a dead relative in the dark, how to control the emotional weather of a crowd. She mapped the entire province not in roads or rivers, but in mental fault lines, knowing which communities feared ghosts, which believed in omens, which were most easily infected by whispers of the supernatural. By the late 1950s, her operation had become invisible and total. Even American advisors stationed nearby had no idea that an entire psychological infrastructure was coiling around them, waiting to strike. What she was about to unleash was not rebellion. It was revelation. The first large-scale test of her theory, that fear, once planted in the right conditions, could collapse an empire from within. The web was ready. The vibrations were set. All she needed now was the moment to pull the thread. In 1946, when Nguyen Thi Dinh stood before Ho Chi Minh in the northern stronghold, she did not bow like others did. She looked at him the way a scholar looks at another mind capable of understanding. The old revolutionary had seen war in every form: attrition, ambush, propaganda. But what stood before him that day was something else. A woman who spoke of war as if it were a disease of perception. She told him that fear could be engineered like a contagion, that once released, it could spread without soldiers, without weapons, without oversight. Ho Chi Minh listened in silence. When she finished, he said only one thing. You understand what others do not. That in the modern world, the battlefield is inside the mind. Then he gave her something no one else received. Permission to build her own program, beyond the oversight of the military command. It was not a gift. It was a dangerous trust. A covenant. Ninh took it literally. For over a decade she disappeared into the shadows of the Mekong Delta, studying, experimenting, building what she called Operation Mind Spider. The name was chosen with precision. Spiders do not chase. They weave. They sense vibration. They manipulate perception through tension. And when the prey believes it is safe, that is when it is already caught. Her network grew in silence. Farmers, street vendors, prostitutes, children. They became her eyes, her instruments. Each learned fragments of psychological manipulation. How to seed a rumor that grows like mold in a man's brain. How to mimic the voice of a dead relative in the dark. How to control the emotional weather of a crowd. She mapped the entire province not in roads or rivers, but in mental fault lines, knowing which communities feared ghosts, which believed in omens, which were most easily infected by whispers of the supernatural. By the late 1950s, her operation had become invisible and total. Even American advisors stationed nearby had no idea that an entire psychological infrastructure was coiling around them, waiting to strike. What she was about to unleash was not rebellion, it was revelation. The first large-scale test of her theory, that fear, once planted in the right conditions, could collapse an empire from within. The web was ready, the vibrations were set. All she needed now was the moment to pull the thread. It was January 16th, 1960, the eve of the storm. The moon hung over the Mekong Delta like a dull blade, and every shadow seemed to breathe. In the swamps and coconut groves of Bentry Province, 5,000 women prepared for what no military manual could have predicted. A battle not for land, but for the mind itself. Nguyen Thi Dinh walked among them in silence. She carried no weapon, no insignia, only a strand of black cloth wrapped around her wrist. The mark of the spider's daughters. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many had never held a real gun. But each carried something more dangerous. A fragment of the psychological code Dinh had forged in the years since her imprisonment. Each had been trained to become fear itself. There were no loud orders, no flags, no speeches. Only whispered instructions passed from one woman to the next, like a virus. Every sound, every smell, every movement of the coming operation had been rehearsed to target the most primitive layers of the human mind. Even the timing, 3:00 a.m., when the human psyche is most vulnerable to hallucination and dread, was chosen to exploit natural rhythms of fear. Dinh had studied the soldiers they would face in microscopic detail. Through barbers, tailors, prostitutes, even children who sold fruit at military checkpoints. She had compiled dossiers on each man. His habits, his trauma, his superstitions, his private terrors. Which soldier feared water? Which one dreamt of his dead father? Which one heard voices when drunk? All of it catalogued. They would not attack an army that night. They would attack 5,000 individual minds, each collapsing in its own private nightmare. As the final hour approached, the women began their transformation. Faces painted white with ash. Eyes blackened with soot until no whites remained. Their bodies smeared with sap that glistened like swallow, eat but smelled faintly of decay. In their hands, bamboo poles carved to resemble rifles. Twisted, imperfect, deliberately uncanny. Instruments not of death, but of distortion. When the drums began, slow, arrhythmic, like a heartbeat skipping, the women raised their bamboo weapons toward the mist. Nguyen Thi Dinh closed her eyes and whispered the single phrase that had guided her entire life. They think they understand fear because they cause it. They have never seen what happens when fear fights back. The order was given, and the world's most powerful military would soon meet something it couldn't comprehend. It began at exactly 3:03 a.m., the hour when human consciousness drifts closest to nightmare, when the body's defenses are at their lowest ebb. The American-backed garrison at Ba Tri was silent except for the sound of insects, the metallic hum of a generator, and the restless shifting of men who had forgotten what sleep felt like. Then came the first sound. A single child's cry. Distant, echoing through the palms. It wasn't unusual. There were villages nearby, but something about it was wrong. The pitch, the rhythm, too deliberate, too slow. It came again, closer this time, accompanied by the faint rattle of bamboo in the wind. Then silence. Then a voice, a woman's, whispering the names of the soldiers, one by one. At first, they thought it was a cruel prank by the Viet Minh. But when the men checked their radios, the frequencies were dead. No static, no signal. Just a low, pulsing hum, like the sound of breathing inside a cave. Then came the shapes. Dozens of them, moving through the fog. Human, but not human. Faces pale, eyes black, bodies smeared in ash and sap that gleamed under the searchlights. Some swayed, some crawled, some walked backward as if time itself had reversed around them. The commanding officer shouted for his men to open fire, but hesitation rippled through the ranks. The figures didn't flinch. They didn't even seem alive. Bullets tore through them, and still they came, whispering in broken, overlapping voices. Phrases the soldiers' minds twisted into the voices of their wives, their mothers, their dead children. The effect was immediate. Coordination collapsed. Radios were smashed. Some men shot themselves, convinced they'd been possessed. Others fled into the jungle, screaming that the dead were walking. In less than 20 minutes, an entire garrison of 350 men had disintegrated into chaos without a single conventional casualty inflicted. And all the while, from a ridge above the mist, Nguyen Thi Dinh watched, unmoving, her expression unreadable. To her, this wasn't horror. It was validation. A perfect demonstration of her thesis, that once you could bend perception, control of the physical world followed naturally. By dawn, the fog lifted. The women were gone, leaving behind nothing but footprints, shattered radios, and the residue of a fear so deep it lingered like a scent. The U.S. reports would later call it an instance of mass hysteria. But the villagers whispered a different name, the night the mind broke. By sunrise, the jungle had gone unnaturally quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Smoke drifted over Ba Tri, but there was no sign of battle. No shell craters, no bodies, no blood. Only abandoned helmets, half-eaten rations, and rifles left where men had dropped them mid-hallucination. When reinforcements arrived hours later, they found soldiers wandering aimlessly, muttering incoherent phrases, eyes glassy and unfocused. Some clawed at their own skin, whispering that things were inside them. The American doctors who examined them wrote it off as combat-induced psychosis. But the reports didn't match any known psychological pattern. Every man described hearing something different. Voices of loved ones, strange music, children's laughter echoing inside their skulls. Yet when those testimonies were cross-referenced, one detail repeated with chilling precision, a whisper that knew their names. Within weeks, the story spread across the Mekong Delta. But it didn't spread like a military report. It spread like a superstition. Villagers spoke of women who could walk through dreams, who could bend a man's sanity with their gaze. Soldiers refused to patrol at night. Radios went silent after 3 a.m. Commanders began to notice something unexplainable. Morale was collapsing faster than casualties could account for. Entire units reported phantom figures on the perimeters. Some swore they saw faces in the mist. Others claimed the jungle itself was watching. Washington dismissed these accounts as enemy disinformation. But within the CIA's Psychological Operations Division, one phrase appeared again and again in classified memos. The Dinh phenomenon. Analysts warned that whatever had happened at Ba Tree was not an isolated incident. It was a strategy spreading unseen. And worse, it was contagious. Once a soldier heard the rumors, he carried them like an info, action, transmitting fear to others without ever encountering the source. Nguyen Thi Dinh had achieved something no army in history had, a self-propagating weapon. Her followers didn't need to attack anymore. The fear was doing the work for them. It traveled through rumor, through dreams, through the nervous systems of men who had never even seen her. By the end of that year, entire provinces were under psychological quarantine, villages abandoned, radios burned, patrols refused to leave their bases. The Pentagon called it a breakdown of command. But in the jungles of Vietnam, the locals had another name for it, the spider's breath. By late 1960, the fear had metastasized. Patrols refused to march. Officers reported shadow seizures, moments when entire platoons froze, convinced they were being watched by something unseen. The Pentagon couldn't quantify it. The CIA, however, could. They called it psychogenic collapse, mass paralysis induced by belief. It terrified them because it couldn't be bombed, interrogated, or cured. So they did what intelligence agencies always do when faced with the inexplicable. They tried to copy it. From Saigon, a covert task force was formed under Psychological Operations Command, codename Project Oracle. Its stated purpose was to neutralize Nguyen Thi Dinh's doctrine through reverse-engineered behavioral conditioning. Its true purpose was darker, to steal her weapon. They brought in psychiatrists, hypnotists, sensory deprivation experts, even priests. The project's director, Colonel Arthur Hale, believed Dinh had tapped into what he called the limbic frequency, a resonant psychological wavelength that synchronized fear across multiple minds. If that frequency could be replicated, he argued, it could be used not just against the Viet Minh, but against entire populations. Captured prisoners were subjected to experiments in isolation chambers modeled after Bahra prison, though none knew that Dinh herself had once studied human reactions in a similar way. American scientists pumped low-frequency sound through the walls, introduced optical distortions, and seeded hallucinations through chemical means. The results were catastrophic. Subjects lost all sense of identity within days, some screaming that spiders were crawling beneath their skin, a detail that appeared nowhere in their conditioning material. It was as if the idea of Dinh, her pattern, had infected the project itself. Notes began disappearing. Recordings played voices no one remembered capturing. All-in-all Hale started speaking of the web, saying that once you tried to study it, it began to study you. The Pentagon shut Project Oracle down in 1962, classifying its findings as existentially hazardous. All physical files were burned at Pleiku Base, but survivors later whispered that one reel of magnetic tape was salvaged, marked with a single Vietnamese word, so, fear. And somewhere in the Mekong, Nguyen Thi Dinh continued her work, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that the enemy had tried to look into her mirror and had seen something staring back. Project Oracle was supposed to end with fire. The reels, the tapes, the transcripts of what could never be explained. But fear, once recorded, does not burn. What the CIA didn't understand was that by trying to decode Nguyen Thi Dinh's work, they had already become part of it. The experiment wasn't something you could turn off. It was a contagion that lived in the act of observation itself. The first signs appeared weeks after the Pleiku incineration. 3 analysts stationed in Saigon reported identical nightmares. A jungle filled with whispering women whose faces were blank, who crawled across the ceiling whispering the names of their children. One man clawed his own ears out. Another wrote, "It's in the signal." Then he walked into the river and never resurfaced. Back in Langley, the final transmission from Vietnam arrived, a warped reel-to-reel recording, degraded, humming with low static. When played, technicians described a faint rhythmic sound beneath the noise, like breathing. Some heard words. Others heard laughter. One linguist swore he heard the phrase, in Vietnamese, "You studied fear, now you feed it." After that, strange incidents began spreading through the network. Operators on late shifts reported phantom transmissions on unused frequencies, Morse code patterns that spelled nonsense until decoded phonetically into Vietnamese syllables. Lights flickered at specific intervals. Typists swore their machines retyped their words backward. One psychologist later wrote in a confidential memo, "We built a mirror to understand her. The mirror started showing us." The agency quietly quarantined the entire Oracle branch, ordering psychological screenings and ritual burnings of equipment. But the whispers persisted. The more they tried to suppress it, the more it adapted. Fear had learned its new language. Bureaucracy, data, tape. Nguyen Thi Dinh had never stepped foot inside Langley, yet her theory had crossed the ocean, embedded in sound waves, carried by the very instruments meant to destroy her. By 1963, internal memos referred to it as the mirror reversal, the point where the observers became the infected. The U.S. military doubled its troop presence in Vietnam that year. But what they didn't realize was this. They weren't fighting a revolution anymore. They were fighting an idea, one that had learned to live inside their own minds. By 1964, Vietnam had become a theater of ghosts. Battles were still fought, bombs still fell, but the war's logic had shifted, subtly, invisibly, towards something no strategist could quantify. The Americans called it untraceable morale decay. Soldiers stopped trusting their own senses. They mistook shadows for ambushes, whispers for commands. At first, superiors blamed exhaustion. But the pattern was too precise, too coordinated. Wherever Nguyen Thi Dinh's network operated, discipline collapsed like a nervous system under shock. Entire regiments would lose hours, wandering in circles, firing at sounds that weren't there. Aerial photographs later revealed that these wandering paths formed perfect spirals, like webs drawn into the jungle floor. One analyst noticed that each spiral's center coincided with an abandoned village, always one that had been visited by Dinh's women months earlier. When maps of the delta were overlaid with these spiral paths, they formed a single massive pattern spanning hundreds of miles, a geometric diagram of control. Dinh had done the impossible. She had transformed the terrain of war into a living psychological map. Her soldiers weren't armed with rifles, but with information. Details about a man's mother, a unit's sleeping habits, the cadence of footsteps that triggered paranoia. Her army was invisible because it wasn't made of bodies. It was made of beliefs. The U.S. response was brutal and predictable. Villages were burned, women interrogated, suspected collaborators executed. But the harder they tried to crush her, the deeper her legend spread. To the locals, she became more than a commander. She became an apparition, a being who walked between life and death. Farmers left offerings at crossroads, believing she could protect them from madness. Even American troops began whispering her name, the Spider Lady, half in Moum, Curry, half in awe. Field reports grew stranger. Pilots described fog forming into faces at night. Infantry claimed the jungle hummed, a low, resonant vibration just beneath human hearing, making them nauseous, disoriented. Military psychologists dismissed it as tropical fatigue. But somewhere in Hanoi, Nguyen Thi Dinh smiled. She knew what they could not admit. The war's front line no longer ran through the Mekong or the highlands. It ran through the nervous systems of every soldier who entered her country. And fear, her true army, was now winning territory faster than any division could reclaim it. When the uprising in Ben Tre finally broke the colonial chain, The countryside didn't erupt in celebration. It went still. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. The silence of a people who had crossed a line they could never uncross. Nguyen Thi Dinh stood at the center of it all, surrounded by women who looked less like soldiers than farmers who had stepped out of the fields and into history. They had no uniforms, no rank, only the same expression carved into every face, a calm that came from knowing they could no longer be broken. In the days after the victory, government soldiers crept back into the abandoned outposts. They found slogans painted on walls, half-burned banners, and the smell of coconut smoke clinging to everything. No trophies, no bodies, just absence, the kind that unnerves even the victorious. Somewhere in that emptiness, Dinh was reorganizing. She moved her fighters by riverboat and footpath, slipping between hamlets that the enemy considered pacified. Every woman she met received the same lesson. You are not a witness to history. You are its weapon. The long-haired army that rose from those villages wasn't a myth. It was an intelligence network, a supply chain, a communication web hidden inside daily life. Women carried coded messages inside baskets of rice, slipped ammunition beneath laundry, whispered coordinates beneath folk songs. To outsiders, it looked like superstition or rumor, but to Dinh, it was the only possible science, a system of human links that no machine could trace. Foreign advisors studied her reports and called them anomalies. They wrote that she weaponized culture, that she had turned motherhood into logistics, grief into organization. But those who met her saw something simpler. She understood that the strongest fortress is built inside the mind. Her calm, precise voice could dissolve panic faster than morphine. Even captured officers admitted later that she frightened them because she never raised her tone. By the end of 1960, Ben Tre was no longer just a province. It was a signal, proof that a peasant woman could rewrite the manual of modern warfare without firing a single unnecessary shot. And in the shadows of that realization, every empire that had ever relied on fear began to feel its foundations tremble. The aftermath of Ben Tre didn't fade. It multiplied. The shock of the uprising spread faster than radio signals, carried by rumor, by whispers, by the kind of stories that nations try to suppress and fail. To the South Vietnamese command, it was an anomaly. To the Americans arriving to stabilize the region, it was a warning they didn't understand. But to the villagers watching from the rice paddies, it was revelation. Nguyen Thi Dinh had proven something impossible. That conviction could be organized like an army. She built no monuments, claimed no throne. Her battlefield was the human will. Her victory was not the defeat of an enemy, but the erasure of fear itself. Every hamlet that heard her name began to behave differently. Markets stayed open under curfew. Villagers refused to bow when soldiers shouted. Authority, once absolute, began to fracture in invisible ways. American intelligence analysts studying captured correspondents called it morale infection. They wrote of psychological contagion zones, villages where resistance persisted even when leadership had been wiped out. They did not realize that the infection was not psychological. It was philosophical. Dinh had replaced obedience with purpose. She had transformed the idea of control from something imposed to something generated within. Her long-haired army grew into a vast, decentralized intelligence network. Women coordinated attacks, ran supply chains, even negotiated ceasefires, all under the cover of daily life. They moved through checkpoints unseen because the occupiers never believed women could hold power, let alone strategy. Dinh exploited that blindness with precision. The enemy's greatest weapon, she said, is the belief that we are powerless. By 1962, her influence had reached far beyond Ben Tre. Northern commanders sought her counsel. Propaganda officers studied her speeches, and among American field advisors, her name began to surface in classified briefings, spoken with a mix of fascination and dread. Some described her as the ghost of Ben Tre, a commander who fought without fighting, who could move an army with an idea. Yet to those who followed her, she was something simpler. A mother who taught them that survival itself could be defiance, that endurance was the sharpest blade. In the jungles of southern Vietnam, where empires had risen and rotted, her quiet revolution had already begun rewriting the future. By the mid-1960s, the legend of Ben Tre had drifted far beyond the Mekong. It crossed oceans on the tongues of journalists, diplomats, and spies. A half-whispered tale of a woman who had turned an empire's playbook against itself. In Cuba, she was studied like scripture. In Algeria, independence fighters quoted her speeches. And in America, young activists, reading between censored lines of wartime reports, found in her story a strange, dangerous beauty, resistance that looked like grace. Nguyen Thi Dinh had never sought fame. She distrusted it. Attention, she once said, is the last stage of misunderstanding. Her goal was endurance, not for herself, but for the collective will of her people. Still, recognition found her. Northern generals called her Chi Ka, Kwakek Mang, the elder sister of the revolution. To them, she embodied something beyond tactics, a kind of moral symmetry. She believed that to fight tyranny effectively, one must never mirror its cruelty. Power was not to be seized. It was to be redefined. But redefinition came with cost. The deeper her influence spread, the more personal the war became. Her movements were tracked. Her image was studied by analysts who tried to decode her psychology. In Washington, her name appeared in a secret report labeled High-Value Morale Target. They understood that killing her might slow the resistance, but martyrdom could ignite it. She was both threat and symbol, and in that duality lay her invincibility. Her forces, many still unarmed, expanded across the delta like a slow tide. Villages coordinated through songs, children carried coded messages, elders passed strategies disguised as proverbs. The network had no center and no end. "We are the river," she told them. "Cut one branch, and another flows around the blade." Those who met her in person spoke of a quiet that felt supernatural. She did not comment hunt. She listened. Her presence erased panic. Even hardened soldiers said they felt disarmed by her calm, as if standing before something inevitable. In time, she would rise to become the first female general of Vietnam. But her real command had already begun years earlier, when she realized the most dangerous weapon in any war was not violence. It was the human capacity to believe that freedom was inevitable. Victory did not arrive with trumpets. It came slowly, unevenly, through exhaustion, hunger, and the quiet realization that survival itself was the final act of defiance. By 1975, when Saigon fell and the war's long shadow began to lift, Nguyen Thi Dinh stood among the ruins, not as a conqueror, but as a witness. The fields were silent again, the same silence that had followed Ben Tre 15 years earlier. Only now it carried the weight of ghosts. The nation she had fought to free was fractured. Families divided by allegiance faced each other across dinner tables. Towns rebuilt on bones. Dinh understood what few others could. That the hardest part of any revolution isn't victory. It's what follows. Liberation without healing becomes another kind of captivity. She turned her attention from the battlefield to reconstruction, traveling from village to village, urging women to lead in peace as fiercely as they had in war. "You cannot feed freedom with ashes," she said. She organized schools, agricultural cooperatives, medical clinics, rebuilding not from policy, but from trust. To her, recovery was not a government program. It was a moral duty, an act of remembrance. Yet even in peace, the war never fully ended for her. She carried the names of the lost, her husband, her comrades, her children who had grown up without her, as if they were maps. Every decision she made traced their memory. When foreign journalists asked what victory meant, she answered softly, "It means we can finally count our dead out loud." In those years, Nguyen Thi Dinh became a symbol not of battle, but of endurance. Her portrait hung in schools beside the flag. Young girls were taught her name as proof that courage could have a woman's face. Still, she resisted myth. Do not worship the past, she told her students. Use it. She lived long enough to see Vietnam begin to breathe again. Unevenly, painfully, but alive. And though time eroded monuments and slogans, her legacy remained in the quiet defiance of those who remembered her lessons. That strength is not in domination, but in persistence. That the truest victory is not survival of the body, but survival of the will. By the late 1980s, age began to touch Nguyen Thi Dinh, but it could not quiet her. Her steps slowed, yet her presence remained electric. Wherever she appeared, people fell silent, not out of reverence but recognition. They saw in her a reflection of what they had endured. The woman who once commanded invisible armies now moved through hospital wards and rural schools, her uniform replaced by plain cotton clothes. A nation, she would say, must learn to heal as fiercely as it learned to fight. Her speeches were never grand. They were stories, fragments of rivers, fields, and faces. She spoke of the mothers who had buried sons, of the children who had grown up mistaking thunder for shellfire. She did not promise glory. She promised endurance. To her, peace was not a conclusion. It was a discipline, the daily work of refusing to return to cruelty. As Vietnam began to change, cities glowing with new lights, foreign investors arriving where tanks once stood, many feared the old values would fade. But Dinh never belonged to nostalgia. The world, she told a group of students in Ben Tre, will tempt you to forget. That is its way of winning. Her voice trembled now, but her words still cut through the air like a command. When illness finally confined her to bed, visitors described her room as both shrine and classroom. Flowers lined the windowsills. On the table lay a small notebook, its pages filled with brief, uneven lines, fragments of thought, plans for a future she knew she would not see. Among the last words she wrote were these: "Freedom is not something we inherit. It is something we keep alive by remembering." She passed quietly, without ceremony. But in the days that followed, villages across the Delta lit candles by their doorways. No decree ordered it. No official message spread the call. It was instinct, the same silent coordination that had once fueled her revolution. And so, even in death, Nguyen Thi Dinh commanded movement. The river of her life, slow, persistent, unstoppable, continued to flow through the people she had awakened. For them, her absence was not an ending. It was the proof that she had never truly been one person, but a current running through all of them. In the years after her passing, Nguyen Thi Dinh's memory did not fade. It deepened, spreading quietly through Vietnam's consciousness like a subterranean river. Her name began to appear in songs, in whispered prayers before dawn, in the classrooms where teachers told their students not just what she had done, but what she had refused to become. She had never wanted statues, but they rose anyway. Not out of vanity, but necessity. People needed to see her face to remind themselves that courage could be human. In Ben Tre, elders said that when the wind moved through the coconut trees at night, it carried her voice. Calm, deliberate, unyielding. "Remember who you are," it seemed to say. Fishermen told of lanterns flickering on calm water when storms approached, as though some unseen force was warning them to turn back. Myths gathered around her the way mist gathers around the river at dawn, not created, but breathed into being by gratitude. Even those who had once opposed her found themselves haunted by her legacy. Former officers years after the war spoke her name with a strange reverence. She did not hate, one confessed. That was her power. Historians debated her tactics, politicians invoked her ideals, but the people, the ones she had fought beside, carried her memory in simpler ways. through small acts of defiance, through kindness that did not bow. Across decades, her legend evolved into something larger than ideology. She became a symbol not of victory or war, but of balance, the quiet strength that survives chaos without becoming it. Artists painted her surrounded by rivers that curved like veins, the lifeblood of a nation. Children recited her words during school ceremonies. We do not inherit freedom, we practice it. And so, the myth of Nguyen Thi Dinh lived on, not in the pages of official history, but in the silence before dawn, in the hands of women planting rice, in the eyes of the next generation who no longer remembered her face, but carried her fire. In that way, she achieved what every empire failed to grasp, that true power does not vanish with the body. It transforms, moving unseen, a pulse beneath the soil, a rhythm that continues long after the drums of war have gone silent. Time moved on, but her presence refused to dissolve. Generations who had never known war still spoke her name with the same hushed certainty reserved for something sacred. Textbooks reduced her to dates and ranks, but in the villages, her memory lived differently. Not as a hero, but as a reminder. Mothers would tell their children, when you feel afraid, remember the woman who turned fear into light. It was not history, it was inheritance. In Ben Tre, the river she once crossed as a young revolutionary still cut through the fields, slow and patient. Locals said that when the sun set just right, its surface shimmered crimson. Not with violence, but with the echo of everything she endured. Pilgrims left flowers at the water's edge. They didn't pray for victory, they prayed for courage. As Vietnam transformed, cities glowing where jungles once burned, her image remained uncomfortably present. In glass towers and crowded markets, her portrait hung not as decoration, but as a question. What will you do with the freedom you were given? For many, that gaze was heavier than any monument. Writers began to call her the River Mother, a name that outlived ideology. She became a metaphor for endurance itself, for the quiet, unending motion of people who refuse to be defined by suffering. Her story spread beyond borders, translated into languages that could not quite capture the tone of her calm defiance. And yet, wherever her story was told, listeners felt the same stillness, that strange mixture of grief and strength that outlasts both war and peace. In the end, Nguyen Thi Dinh belonged to no single generation, no government, no flag. She belonged to the moments between, the breath before a decision, the silence after loss, the small unrecorded acts that keep a people alive. She taught that the truest revolutions are not fought with weapons, but with the refusal to forget.